The next morning, Susan sat in the cramped conference room of her lawyer's office, her fingers drumming anxiously on the table. After a tense night in the holding cell, she'd been released on bail, but the charges still loomed over her like a dark cloud. Her lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn, pored over the EPA's evidence, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This is quite the predicament you found yourself in, Mrs. Wilkins." Susan leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "Evelyn, you have to help me. I didn't do anything wrong. I've never used pesticides on my lawn, not once. There has to be an explanation for those test results." Evelyn pursed her lips. "I understand, and I believe you. Unfortunately, the EPA seems quite convinced of your guilt." She tapped the thick file of evidence. "These test results are quite damning." Susan felt her stomach twist. "But I've done everything by the book. My lawn is completely organic. I've spent years perfecting it." Evelyn held up a hand. "I believe you, Suzanne. The question is, how do we prove it?" Just then, the conference room door burst open, and Robert strode in, his face flushed with anger. "I just got off the phone with the HOA president. He all but admitted they're behind this whole mess." Suzanne's eyes widened. "The HOA? But why would they do this?" Robert's hands clenched into fists. "Apparently, they've been getting complaints for years about your excessively green lawn. They thought a little EPA investigation would force you to start using chemicals like the rest of us." Evelyn's brows rose. "So they filed a false complaint, knowing it would trigger an EPA investigation." Robert nodded, his expression grim. "Exactly. They wanted to take you down a peg, and they didn't care who they had to drag through the mud to do it." Susan felt the blood drain from her face. "But that's unbelievable. How could they do this?" Evelyn tapped her pen against the table, her eyes narrowed. "Well, Mrs. Wilkins, it seems we may have found the key to your defense. If we can prove the HOA's involvement in this, it could cast serious doubt on the EPA's case." Robert leaned forward, his voice tense. "So what do we do? How do we take these bastards down?" Evelyn held up a hand. "One step at a time. First, we need to gather as much evidence as possible. Anything that links the HOA to this investigation. Emails, phone records, witness statements, the works." Susan felt a glimmer of hope. "You really think we can beat this?" Evelyn offered a reassuring smile. "With the right strategy and the right evidence, I believe we can. But it won't be easy. The EPA and the HOA will be pulling out all the stops to make sure this sticks." Robert's jaw tightened. "Well, they picked the wrong family to mess with. Susan and I are ready to do whatever it takes to clear her name." Susan reached across the table, squeezing Robert's hand. "Thank you, darling. I don't know what I'd do without you." As Evelyn began outlining their plan of attack, Susan felt a renewed sense of determination. She was going to fight this, no matter what it took. She was going to prove her innocence and take down the HOA once and for all. Susan's heart pounded as the police officers stepped into her home. "Arrest? What is the meaning of this?" The shorter officer consulted his notes. "Mrs. Wilkins, you're being charged with the illegal use of pesticides and environmental tampering. We have a warrant for your immediate apprehension." Susan felt the world tilt on its axis. "But that's impossible. I haven't done anything wrong." The taller officer raised a hand. "Ma'am, we understand this is upsetting, but we have no choice but to execute this warrant. If you could please come with us, we can sort this out at the station." Suzanne's mind raced, desperately searching for a way out of this nightmare. "Please, there's been a terrible mistake. My lawn is completely organic. I've never used any pesticides." The officers exchanged a glance. "That's for the courts to decide, ma'am. Now, if you'll come with us." Suzanne's hands trembled as the officers handcuffed her, guiding her toward the waiting patrol car. As they drove away, she stared out the window in stunned silence, her heart pounding. How had this happened? 1 minute, she'd been proudly tending her lush green lawn, the envy of the entire homeowners association. And now she was being arrested, facing ruinous fines and potential jail time. All because her grass was too green. When the patrol car pulled up to the station, Susan was led inside and booked on the charges. As she sat in a holding cell, her mind spun, grasping for some way to prove her innocence. Just then, the cell door swung open, and her husband, Robert, rushed in. "Suzanne, what's going on?" Susan gripped the bars, her eyes pleading. "Robert, you have to help me. The EPA and the police, they're saying I used illegal pesticides on the lawn. But you know that's not true. I've never touched that stuff." Robert's face fell. The EPA was here, and now you're under arrest. Susan nodded, her voice trembling. "They found traces of banned substances in the soil. They say I'm facing fines of up to $50,000 per violation and possible criminal charges." Robert's eyes widened in horror. $50,000? Suzanne, we don't have that kind of money. Suzanne's shoulders slumped. "I know. And now I'm sitting here, waiting to be arraigned. Robert, you have to do something. You have to help me prove my innocence." Robert gripped the bars, his knuckles turning white. "Don't worry, honey. I'll figure this out. We'll get the best lawyer in town, and we'll fight this, no matter what it takes." Susan felt a glimmer of hope. "Really? You think we can beat this?" Robert nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Absolutely. This is all just a big misunderstanding. We'll get you out of here, and then we're going to take down that damn homeowners association for doing this to you." Susan managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Robert. I don't know what I'd do without you." As the cell door clanged shut behind him, Susan leaned back against the cold, hard bench, her mind racing. She had to find a way to prove her innocence and clear her name. The stakes were too high to fail. The next morning, Susan sat in the cramped conference room of her lawyer's office, her fingers drumming anxiously on the table. After a tense night in the holding cell, she'd been released on bail, but the charges still loomed over her like a dark cloud. Her lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn, pored over the EPA's evidence, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This is quite the predicament you found yourself in, Mrs. Wilkins." Susan leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "Evelyn, you have to help me. I didn't do anything wrong. I've never used pesticides on my lawn, not once. There has to be an explanation for those test results." Evelyn pursed her lips. "I understand, and I believe you. Unfortunately, the EPA seems quite convinced of your guilt." She tapped the thick file of evidence. "These test results are quite damning." Susan felt her stomach twist. "But I've done everything by the book. My lawn is completely organic. I've spent years perfecting it." Evelyn held up a hand. "I believe you, Suzanne. The question is, how do we prove it?" Just then, the conference room door burst open, and Robert strode in, his face flushed with anger. "I just got off the phone with the HOA president. He all but admitted they're behind this whole mess." Suzanne's eyes widened. "The HOA? But why would they do this?" Robert's hands clenched into fists. "Apparently, they've been getting complaints for years about your excessively green lawn. They thought a little EPA investigation would force you to start using chemicals like the rest of us." Evelyn's brows rose. "So they filed a false complaint, knowing it would trigger an EPA investigation." Robert nodded, his expression grim. "Exactly. They wanted to take you down a peg, and they didn't care who they had to drag through the mud to do it." Susan felt the blood drain from her face. "But that's unbelievable. How could they do this?" Evelyn tapped her pen against the table, her eyes narrowed. "Well, Mrs. Wilkins, it seems we may have found the key to your defense. If we can prove the HOA's involvement in this, it could cast serious doubt on the EPA's case." Robert leaned forward, his voice tense. So what do we do? How do we take these bastards down? Evelyn held up a hand. One step at a time. First, we need to gather as much evidence as possible. Anything that links the HOA to this investigation. Emails, phone records, witness statements. The works. Susan felt a glimmer of hope. You really think we can beat this? Evelyn offered a reassuring smile. With the right strategy and the right evidence, I believe we can. But it won't be easy. The EPA and the HOA will be pulling out all the stops to make sure this sticks. Robert's jaw tightened. Well, they picked the wrong family to mess with. Susan and I are ready to do whatever it takes to clear her name. Susan reached across the table, squeezing Robert's hand. Thank you, darling. I don't know what I'd do without you. As Evelyn began outlining their plan of attack, Susan felt a renewed sense of determination. She was going to fight this, no matter what it took. She was going to prove her innocence and take down the HOA once and for all. Over the next few days, Susan and Robert threw themselves into gathering evidence, leaving no stone unturned. They combed through old emails, scrutinized meeting minutes, and interviewed neighbors, all in a desperate bid to uncover the HOA's involvement in this debacle. The more they uncovered, the more their suspicions were confirmed. It was clear the HOA had orchestrated the entire EPA investigation, motivated by petty jealousy over Suzanne's immaculate lawn. Look at this, Robert said, brandishing a stack of printouts. The HOA president was in direct contact with the EPA case officer, feeding him evidence and pushing for the investigation. Evelyn studied the documents, her brow furrowed. This is certainly damning. If we can prove the HOA's involvement, it could seriously undermine the EPA's case. Susan let out a shaky breath. I just can't believe they would do this. All because my lawn was too perfect. Evelyn's expression hardened. Unfortunately, some people will stop at nothing to maintain their perceived status and control. The HOA seemed determined to put you in your place. Robert's jaw tightened. Well, they're about to learn a very harsh lesson. No one messes with my wife and gets away with it. Evelyn held up a hand. Easy, Robert. As satisfying as it might be to lash out, we need to stay focused on the legal battle at hand. The key is to build an airtight case that will leave the EPA and the HOA with no choice but to back down. Suzanne nodded, her resolve hardening. You're right. I'm not going to let them bully me into submission. I'm going to fight this, no matter what it takes. In the days that followed, Susan and Robert worked tirelessly, uncovering more and more evidence of the HOA's underhanded scheme. They obtained phone records, email exchanges, and even a sworn statement from a former HOA board member who had resigned in protest over the group's tactics. As they presented their findings to Evelyn, the lawyer's eyes gleamed with triumph. This is exactly what we needed. With this evidence, we can not only get the charges against you dismissed, but we can also sue the HOA for malicious prosecution and abuse of power. Susan felt a wave of relief wash over her. So we can beat this. We can clear my name. Evelyn nodded, a confident smile spreading across her face. Absolutely. The EPA's case is built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. Once we expose the HOA's involvement, the whole thing will crumble. Robert let out a triumphant whoop, pulling Suzanne into a tight embrace. I told you we'd take those bastards down. Susan felt tears of joy prick at the corners of her eyes. After weeks of anguish and uncertainty, the end was finally in sight. She was going to beat this, and she was going to make the HOA pay for what they'd done. As Evelyn began outlining their legal strategy, Suzanne felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was more determined than ever to reclaim her good name and teach the HOA a lesson they would never forget. This was no longer just about her lawn. It was about standing up to the bullies and proving that the truth would always prevail. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as Susan and her legal team took their seats. Across the aisle, The EPA representatives and the HOA president sat with stern expressions, their lawyers flanking them. Evelyn stood, her voice steady and confident. Your Honor, we are here today to expose a gross abuse of power and a blatant attempt to undermine the rule of law. The judge, a stern-faced man with graying hair, nodded. The floor is yours, Ms. Rosewood. Evelyn launched into a detailed account of the HOA's involvement in the EPA investigation, presenting a mountain of evidence that left the opposing side visibly shaken. As you can see, Your Honor, the HOA president and his cohorts deliberately manipulated the system to target my client, Mrs. Wilkins, due to their own petty jealousy and desire for control, Evelyn said, her gaze sweeping the room. This was never about environmental protection. It was about flexing their muscle and putting a proud homeowner in her place. The EPA representative, a middle-aged woman with a severe bun, rose to her feet. Your Honor, while we take these allegations seriously, the fact remains that our investigation uncovered clear evidence of illegal pesticide use on the Wilkins property. The test results speak for themselves. Evelyn pounced. Ah, but that's where you're mistaken, Ms. Granger. The evidence we've presented today shows that those very test results were tainted by the HOA's interference. In fact, we have a sworn statement from a former board member who admits to colluding with the EPA to fabricate the findings. The judge's brow furrowed. Is this true, Ms. Granger? The EPA representative shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, I was not aware of these allegations. If what Ms. Rosewood is saying is true, then we may need to reevaluate our position. Susan felt a surge of hope as the judge's gaze swept the courtroom. It would appear we have a rather complex situation on our hands. Ms. Rosewood, do you have any further evidence to support your claims? Evelyn nodded, her expression triumphant. We do, Your Honor. In fact, we've uncovered a trove of emails and documents that clearly show the HOA president colluding with the EPA to target my client. We also have testimony from several neighbors who witnessed the HOA's attempts to sabotage Mrs. Wilkins' lawn. The HOA president, a portly man with a receding hairline, leaped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is all hearsay and circumstantial evidence. There's no proof that the EPA's findings were tampered with. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Oh, but there it is, Mr. Sampson, and we have the receipts to prove it. As she methodically laid out the evidence, the courtroom erupted into a cacophony of murmurs and gasps. The judge's expression grew increasingly grave, and even the EPA representative appeared shaken. Finally, the judge raised a hand, silencing the room. It would appear, Ms. Granger, that your investigation has been severely compromised by the actions of the Homeowners Association. I have no choice but to dismiss all charges against Mrs. Wilkins, and to order a full investigation into the HOA's conduct. Susan felt her heart swell with triumph as the courtroom erupted into cheers. She had won, and the HOA was about to pay dearly for their misdeeds. As the gavel fell, Susan felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had beaten the EPA's charges, and now the spotlight was firmly on the Homeowners Association and their underhanded tactics. Evelyn approached, a triumphant smile on her face. Congratulations, Suzanne. You should be very proud of yourself. You stood up to a powerful system and came out on top. Susan pulled her lawyer into a tight hug. I couldn't have done it without you, Evelyn. And without Robert, of course. Her husband stepped forward, his eyes shining with pride. You were amazing, honey. I knew you could do it. Susan squeezed his hand, her gaze turning to the HOA president, who was now being escorted out of the courtroom by a pair of bailiffs. What happens to them now? Evelyn's expression darkened. They're facing some very serious charges: conspiracy, abuse of power, and malicious prosecution, to name a few. The judge has ordered a full investigation, and if the evidence holds up, they could be looking at substantial fines and even jail time. Susan felt a surge of satisfaction. Good. They deserve everything that's coming to them. As the courtroom cleared, Suzanne and her family emerged into the bright sunlight, their spirits high. But their triumph was short-lived, as they were immediately accosted by a horde of reporters, their cameras and microphones thrust in their faces. "Mrs. Wilkins, how does it feel to have beaten the EPA and the Homeowners Association?" one reporter shouted. Susan blinked, momentarily caught off guard. I'm just relieved that the truth finally came out. This was never about my lawn. It was about the HOA's abuse of power." Another reporter chimed in. "What do you plan to do now? Will you be seeking damages from the HOA?" Evelyn stepped forward, raising a hand. "My client will be pursuing all available legal remedies against the Homeowners Association and any individuals involved in this unlawful scheme. However, at this time, we have no further comment." As the reporters continued to shout questions, Suzanne felt a sense of unease. This wasn't just about her lawn anymore. It had become a battle for justice, a chance to expose the corruption and abuse of power that lurked beneath the surface of her idyllic neighborhood. Once they had finally escaped the media frenzy, Susan turned to Robert, her expression serious. "What if this isn't over? What if the HOA tries to retaliate?" Robert pulled her into a reassuring embrace. "Don't worry, honey. Evelyn and her team are going to make sure those bastards pay for what they've done. And we'll be right there with them, every step of the way." Susan nodded, her resolve hardening. "You're right. I'm not going to let them intimidate me. This is about more than just my lawn. It's about standing up to bullies and defending what's right." As they made their way home, Susan couldn't help but glance at her lush, verdant lawn, the source of so much strife and turmoil. But now, it represented something more, a symbol of her resilience, her determination, and her refusal to be cowed by those who sought to abuse their power. This battle was far from over, but Susan was ready to fight, no matter what it took. In the weeks that followed, Suzanne and her legal team worked tirelessly to build their case against the Homeowners Association. The investigation into the HOA's tactics had uncovered a web of corruption and abuse, and they were determined to bring the perpetrators to justice. Evelyn, the formidable lawyer who had spearheaded Suzanne's defense, was relentless in her pursuit of the truth. She pored over countless documents, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and meticulously constructed a case that would leave the HOA with nowhere to hide. "These people thought they could get away with anything," Evelyn said, her eyes narrowed with determination. "But we're going to show them that there are consequences for their actions." Suzanne, bolstered by her victory in the courtroom, was more than ready to take on the HOA. She had spent years building her dream lawn, only to have it used as a weapon against her. Now, she was going to make sure that the HOA paid for their misdeeds. "They thought they could bully me into submission," Suzanne said, her voice steady. "But they picked the wrong person to mess with." As the case progressed, the HOA's tactics became increasingly desperate. They attempted to discredit the witnesses, to cast doubt on the evidence, and to paint Suzanne as a troublemaker. But Evelyn and her team were relentless, methodically dismantling the HOA's defenses. The turning point came when a former HOA board member, who had resigned in protest over the group's tactics, finally agreed to testify. Her account of the HOA's behind-the-scenes maneuvering was damning, leaving the HOA's leadership visibly shaken. They were so focused on maintaining their control and their image that they were willing to trample over anyone who got in their way, the former board member said, her voice trembling with emotion. And they didn't care who they had to hurt to do it. As the trial resumed, the HOA's lawyers made a desperate last-ditch effort to salvage their case. They tried to discredit the former board member, to question the validity of the evidence, and to cast doubt on Susan's character. But Evelyn was undaunted, her cross-examination ruthless and unforgiving. She methodically dismantled the HOA's arguments, leaving them with nowhere to turn. In the end, the jury's verdict was decisive. The HOA was found guilty of conspiracy, abuse of power, and malicious prosecution. The damages awarded to Susan were substantial, a clear message that their tactics would not be tolerated. As Suzanne left the courthouse, her head held high, she couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. She had taken on a powerful and entrenched system, and she had won. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "This is about standing up to bullies and demanding accountability. No one should have to go through what I went through, and I'm not going to stop until I've made sure that the HOA can never do this to anyone else." With the support of her family and her legal team, Susan was more determined than ever to continue her fight. The battle might be won, but the war was far from over. In the aftermath of the trial, Susan found herself thrust into the national spotlight. Her story had struck a chord with people across the country, who had long been familiar with the tyrannical tactics of homeowners associations. Suddenly, Susan was inundated with interview requests, speaking invitations, and even book deals. The world had seen the lengths to which the HOA was willing to go to maintain its grip on the community, and they were hungry for more. Susan, initially reluctant to embrace her newfound fame, soon realized that this was an opportunity to effect real change. With the help of her legal team and a growing army of supporters, she began to mobilize, using her platform to shine a light on the systemic abuses perpetrated by HOAs across the country. For too long, these organizations have operated with impunity, trampling on the rights of homeowners and using their power to bully and intimidate. Susan said, her voice carried by national media outlets. "It's time to put an end to this, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that happens." Evelyn, Suzanne's tireless lawyer, became a key figure in the crusade, using her legal expertise to craft legislation aimed at reining in the power of HOAs. Together, they lobbied lawmakers, organized grassroots campaigns, and built a coalition of like-minded individuals who shared their vision of a more just and equitable system. The battle was not an easy one, as the HOA industry fought back with the full force of its considerable resources and influence. But Suzanne and her team were undaunted, driven by a sense of righteous purpose that only grew stronger with each passing day. As the months turned into years, their efforts began to bear fruit. State after state passed laws limiting the powers of HOAs, and a growing number of homeowners found the courage to stand up to their own tyrannical associations. Suzanne, once a simple homeowner consumed by a battle over her lawn, had become a national icon, a symbol of the fight against the abuses of power and the importance of standing up for one's rights. "This isn't just about my lawn anymore," she said, her eyes shining with determination. "It's about protecting the sanctity of the home, the right of every person to live in peace and freedom, without the fear of being bullied or oppressed by a small group of self-appointed overlords." As the years passed, Suzanne's crusade continued to gain momentum, with her story inspiring others to take up the fight. She wrote a best-selling book, gave countless speeches, and even testified before Congress, her message resonating with people from all walks of life. And when she finally returned to her home, her lush, green lawn now a symbol of her hard-fought victory, Suzanne couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. She had taken on a powerful system and won, and in the process, she had changed the lives of countless others who had suffered under the tyranny of homeowners associations. As she looked out over her lawn, Suzanne knew that the battle was far from over. But with the support of her family, her legal team, and a growing army of supporters, she was more than ready to continue the fight, no matter what obstacles stood in her way. For Suzanne, this was not just about a lawn. It was about standing up for justice, for freedom, and for the rights of every homeowner in America.